Hello everyone, and welcome to today's Google Hangout with our expert consultant, Nicky Hockly. So Nicky's here to answer your questions about the research behind blended learning and learning digitally, learning online. So over to you, Nicky.
Thank you, Alistair, and hello everybody, welcome. Thank you for coming along. Yeah, we've got sort of half an hour in which to do a pretty fast whistle-stop tour of some of the research that's available into learning technologies. This is a particular interest of mine because, well, I've been working in teaching for many, many years, too long to tell you exactly how long, but I've been working online for at least the last 15 or so years. And during the time that I've been working as an English language teacher, there's been a huge increase in interest in technology. I'm not sure whether there's been so much uptake, but there's certainly been an increase in interest. And there's also a lot of hype surrounding the use of educational technologies. So you often hear teachers saying, you know, you should be doing this, you should be using blogs, you should be using tablets and blah, blah, blah. And I think it's important for us as teachers to kind of be aware of what's out there in terms of research. For me, there's one important question, and that is, do learning technologies actually support students' English language acquisition? And that's what we need to be able to answer. Unfortunately, there's no one single answer. It's difficult to say yes or no. The short answer is it depends. And I hope in the next sort of few minutes, half an hour, to be able to tell you why it depends and when it depends with some specific examples. But Alistair, I think we had a couple of questions in via the Google Hangout page, so maybe we should start with those.
Excellent, we have indeed, Nicky. So a question from Gerardo Velaza, who asks, is it possible, or does research support the idea that it's possible to learn English as a foreign language at a distance or through blended learning technologies?
Yeah, again, I'm going to be saying it depends for pretty much every single question that we get in. So sometimes yes, sometimes less clear. If we talk about things like blended learning, the first thing we need to understand is what do we mean by blended learning? There are a number of ways you can define blended learning. And in our field, I think there are two main definitions that we use. The first one is the idea that it's some kind of combination of face-to-face teaching in the classroom plus online or outside the classroom with technology. Okay, that's the kind of one of the most sort of common definition, perhaps. Another definition is the idea that we have our face-to-face teaching, but we bring technology in during our classroom work. So we're using a blend of kind of technology plus non-technology work. Okay, so those are two slightly different things. Now, if we start looking at the research, there's been a huge increase in the amount of blended learning, particularly in mainstream education at primary and secondary school in North America. That's where it's really, really become quite common, I would say, quite accepted. A lot less still, I think, in Europe, although I suspect we will be going down that path in the future. So if we look at some of the research that's been taking place in North America, so we're talking mainly primary school and secondary school students, okay? And of course, also there's lots at university level. But I've been particularly looking at the research for primary and secondary school in North America. It's what's called K-12. Sounds like a planet, but actually it means from kindergarten through to grade 12. If you look at what's happening in the schools there, it's quite interesting. There are a number of schools, for example, which work on this idea of blended learning. At secondary school, there's one called Carpe Diem Collegiate High Schools, and at primary school level, there's one called Rocket Ship Elementary Schools. If you look them up online, they're quite interesting. The model that they use is that kids go to school, okay, so they're in a building, but they divide the kind of time that they're in school between classroom-led activities with teachers and time that is spent in kind of computer labs or computer rooms. So this is a separate room in the building with cubicles, with computers, and the kids are sitting a bit like I am now with headsets, looking directly at the computer screen and doing stuff. The stuff that they're doing is mainly software-based adaptive learning sort of thing. What's often referred to as a personalized learning, meaning that you're taken through a program, along a number of steps, but the program might give you a bit more of this if you're weak on that area, or a bit less of that if you're stronger in that area. So the research into this has looked at, first of all, the drivers. Why is this being implemented within schools? And there's a number of reasons. There's a very strong economic reason. It's a lot cheaper to have your students working individually with computer screens and adaptive software than having teachers and space and so on and so forth. So this is one of the drivers. You can have computer rooms with, basically unqualified people standing around in there making sure that riots don't break out, but you don't need qualified teachers for it. The research seems to be quite mixed, though. Kids are often very good initially at doing these kind of adaptive programs. They get better and better at it. And then because they're using the stuff that they're doing online to then take standardized tests, they're doing quite well on the standardized tests. Although over time, and there have been longitudinal studies into this, over time the test scores start to decline as the students get less enamored of the adaptive learning software. But what's also been found is that although they do kind of get better at tests, and test scores might initially rise, when the students are going over to secondary school or higher education, they're good at taking tests. They're not that great at anything else, like problem solving, critical thinking, and so on and so forth. So there seems to be a question hanging over this blended learning model, whereby if the blend is kind of self-study software at home or in the school, it doesn't matter where it is, there does need to be a balance where the students are getting kind of decent educational input, if you like. So there's still quite a lot of research needed into this whole blended learning idea and whether it's effective or less effective. It seems to depend on quite a few factors.
Okay, thanks. I've got a question from Cesar. You may be able to see, but I think possibly we need a little more information from you, Cesar, on that. You've asked about programs or platforms recommended for improving the use of computers. Are you thinking specifically of getting a general use of computers, or specifically computers for learning purposes? If you could type that into the chat, and we'll come back to you straight after the next question, if that's okay. So got a question from Hartran, who asks about using technology with very young learners and how that can be used effectively. I don't know if you've got any ideas either from research or from your own experience on that.
Yeah, I haven't worked with very young learners myself. By very young learners, I'm understanding kindergarten learners, so pre-primary school. There again, there's some interesting research into this. With kindergarten, or generally kids who are kindergarten age, what they find that is for children who are below 2 years of age, spending any time on digital devices. Of course, if we're talking about technology with very young children these days, we're talking about usually mobile devices, right? They're not going to be sitting like I am in front of a computer with a headset. It's often either a smartphone or perhaps a tablet. They found that for below 2 years old, I mean, it's not a very good idea. It doesn't seem to do much to kids. There's that kind of fear of too much screen time. There was an interesting study carried out by a non-profit organization called the Joan Cooney Gans Center. I wrote it down here so I could get that right. Joan Gans with a Z, Cooney Center. And they interviewed 1,577 parents online. This is in the USA, by the way. And they found that 2 to 4 year olds spent just over 2 hours per day on devices. So they had 2 hours per day screen time, which also included television, by the way, not just mobile devices. They found that generally the parents felt that it was fine for the kids because they were watching, I mean, of course, at that age, the parents control the content, right? So they were watching what the parents considered to be educational content. They found that kids over the age of 4, so from 4 to 6 onwards, of course, the amount of educational content that the kids were exposed to became less and less. And they were spending more screen time per day, so 3 hours plus, but less of that, like 42 minutes a day on average, was being spent on so-called educational content. Pediatricians and doctors and so on are concerned about the amount of time that kids spend on screens. So this is something that educators need to take on board. Certainly from my own point of view, it wouldn't be a matter of having a class of kindergarten kids and then giving each one of them a tablet and having them staring at a screen, because education is also about socialization and social contact with others and so on. So I can certainly see kids using devices to do things collaboratively, jointly, finding out stuff, doing puzzles together, whatever it might be. But I would be very suspicious of any kindergarten education that tried to give kids individual devices and got them to try and kind of study stuff. It's also got to do with what one considers the purpose of kindergarten education. To my mind, it's not about improving test scores. I think that's a very dangerous path to be taking with kindergarten. So I think we need to be a little bit careful. Having said that, there are lots of lovely educational apps, you know, stories, that kind of stuff out there for smaller kids. And the use of those seems to be most effective when it's being mediated by a carer. So, for example, a teacher or a parent or a caregiver. And there's this kind of read aloud, shared story type dynamic, pretty much as you would do with a paper book. But in this case, the kids can tap screens and see stuff and so on. But the basic dynamic is not changing in what you're doing. You're just using a slightly different device.
Thanks. Can I pick up on something you said there? You were talking about, the importance of education being socializing and enabling communication and so on. And would you say that generally the ideal number of devices per child should be one device for two learners to make sure that there is that element of socialization and collaboration?
Yeah, I mean, certainly at those very young ages, definitely. Yeah, if it's it depends on what the learning task is, of course. And kids often, when they're slightly older, let's talk primary, secondary school, they don't want to share. They want their own device so they can do their own thing. But yes, I mean, I've worked with learners not younger than 16 personally, but with mobile devices, and we've had individual devices or sharing, and that seems to work equally well. It's got to do with task design, I think, at the end of the day. Certainly, when we're talking about devices or technology, I'm less keen on the kind of, students sitting and doing app type stuff in class. They can do that outside of class. If we're using the devices in the class, especially if we're language teachers, we should be ensuring that they are springboards, if you like, for communication and collaborative work and so on.
Thanks. I'm pleased to say Cesar's got back to us, and interested particularly in learning purposes, particularly English for specific purposes, maybe tourism and catering, whether you've got any recommendations of particular platforms or technologies that would be helpful for that.
Okay, ESP is not my specialty area, but I think this opens up a more general question about the difference between using computers as springboards for communication and critical thinking, and using computers or devices, I mean, I include mobile devices there, using computers as ways of delivering software. And this is an interesting area within the research. I know I'm not answering Thessa's question exactly, but it is an interesting question to think about. Sure, have an ESP, vocab program or app to do something about your vocabulary when you're at home. But in class, I think we want to be having a more communicative use. There's been one very interesting study I wanted to share with you, was looking at exactly this idea. So this was in the States. It was with primary school students, kind of quite young, so just starting to learn to read, so young primary school kids. And the Los Angeles Unified School District spent a vast amount of money. I can't remember exactly how much, but I can tell you $64 million. That's a lot of cash on a software program called the Waterford Early Reading Program. Now, the idea was that this was a kind of a program, software, adaptive learning type thing to help kids, especially low achieving kids, learn to read better. So they did a kind of a 2-year study, a fairly in-depth research study, and they looked at the kids using this program in class. They had control groups, so classes not using the software and classes using the software. And they did this very long study, and at the end of it, they found no significant difference. Now, that really is pause for thought. $64 million later, no significant difference. I think there's a bit of a problem there. The problem is partly the way the software was used. So the kids were actually using the software instead of getting the kind of traditional face-to-face literacy classes. It had been seen as something they could do extra out of class, but it kind of replaced class. They found that those students who were low achieving, who were not great at reading, found the software really difficult to understand. It was based on print stuff that was being used in the control group, by the way. So they became more and more disengaged with it and demotivated. And in fact, it was like the software had been designed to help the group of students that it ended up helping the least in the whole experiment. And this was a $64 million experiment, as I said. So there's a whole school of thought within research that says, you've got to be careful about assuming that programs are going to help students learn. Technology is often more effective when it's used as a tool to help students think and collaborate. And that's Mark Warschauer. I can quote him directly on that. He says, we need to use technology as a tool to think with.
Indeed.
Mark Warschauer, 2011. That seems to be a more effective way of actually helping students learn than using some of the things like, for example, this Waterford early reading program. So I didn't answer Tessa's question there exactly. I think I just raised some more questions around it.
Yes, I guess that's a very good argument for the importance of running small-scale trials, where rather before you spend $64 million on some software.
Exactly, and in fact the research studies that have shown the best improvements are exactly where some kind of software or device has been brought on board to a school, and then it's done in a very staged way. So they'll have a pilot study with a small group, they'll evaluate the outcomes, and then they'll, if the outcomes are positive, then they will roll it out and so on in this they scale it up, if you like. So there have been successful programs, but you do need to take a very careful incremental approach with new softwares and new technologies.
Absolutely. Okay, thanks. We've got a question now from Sean Wordingham, who asks whether there's been research and replication into what Sugata Mitra found with children sharing a computer without a teacher being present, and the apparently spectacular advances they made. Are you aware of any sort of attempts to replicate that experience?
Not specifically of Sugata Mitra's experiment, but I know that his experiment has come under some criticism. There's a very good critique of his work by Donald Clark, who writes a blog called Plan B. Very nice name for a blog. If you search Donald Clark's Plan B blog, and he reports on a study which followed up on Mitra's Hole in the Wall project, where, after the wonderful successes and so on, like a year later, they kind of went back to see what was happening, and what was happening was nothing. So the spectacular advances that were reported were also a little bit problematic when, the sort of surface was dug under. Tended to be, for example, dominated by boys. The girls were pretty much sidelined. They did learn certain things, but then there was a lot of misuse of the computers for, accessing inappropriate content and so on and so forth. So again, I think it's a good example, perhaps, Mitra's project, plus many other projects, which are given a lot of airtime, a lot of hype, and a lot of publicity. But often there's a little critical element missing there, and people, you need to kind of look a little bit deeper at what's been reported and what the long-term knock-on effect of some of these projects are. The One Laptop Per Child program is a very clear example of this, where there's a lot of hype and a lot of hope, and get your country to buy 10 million laptops given to kids, and it's all going to be brilliant, and they're going to learn. But actually, research shows that this just does not happen. It doesn't happen. Giving children hardware is not an answer. There has to be some kind of mediation process involved, and a whole infrastructure for this to work. This is certainly what One Laptop Per Child studies have shown. It's not just me saying it.
Okay, thanks. I've got a question now from, again, from Gerardo Velasco, who asks, how far is success in the use of a specific technology dependent upon proper teacher training?
Yeah, no, that's a question after my own heart. Very quick answer. It's very dependent on effective teacher training. As a teacher trainer who works with technology, this is absolutely clear, and this is what all the research shows. It's dependent on not just teacher training, although that's a huge element, but obviously things like infrastructure, appropriate materials as well. Again, the one laptop per child is a very good example of this. The few cases, unfortunately they are few, the few cases where the one laptop per child program has worked well, which is, for example, in Uruguay, with what's called the Plan Ceibal, C-E-I-B-A-L. The Plan Ceibal, what they did was they gave out the laptops and so on, but they also made sure that there was a good infrastructure in place. And this has also got to do with kind of, government investment, right? So if a government takes this on as a political thing and there's a will behind it and the economic funds to be able to, supply schools with Wi-Fi, all that sort of stuff, then it can work. So the Ceibal project had not just the laptops, but the infrastructure, the teacher training, and also relevant English language teaching materials, which were developed for that specific context. And having all of those things in mind does seem to support support the integration of technology, to answer you, Gerardo.
Okay, thanks very much. Question now, I'm wondering about vocabulary acquisition and how technology can support that.
Yeah, that's an area that's very popular in research. I think because it's kind of, you can sort of limit it. You can say, okay, let me take these 50 vocabulary words and let's see if the students are going to learn them better with technology or not. So there is a lot of research into the potential of technology to support vocabulary acquisition, but the findings are mixed. So there's one particular study I want to share with you, which I love. I call it the ZOO study. The ZOO study is wonderful. It was carried out in 2011 in the Netherlands with primary school students learning English. And what they did was they took 3 classes of students, right? They were all aged, I think, around 11 to 12. 3 classes. All 3 classes got the same standard face-to-face vocabulary lesson about animals and zoo and all that kind of stuff. So animal vocabulary, if you like. And then what they did was they took 3 classes, right? So they took 2 of the classes to the zoo. And those 2 classes were each given mobile devices with GPS tracking facilities, and the kids went around with their mobile devices, and when they got to, like, the elephant's cage, then because of the GPS positioning thing, some information would pop up about the elephants, and then they could read a little bit about elephants and do something. And then they went around the zoo in this kind of guided way, if you like, with additional information provided by mobile devices. Okay. So we've got 3 classes, 3 had face-to-face class, 2 went to the zoo. We go back to the one of those classes. One of the classes then carried on after the zoo. They went home and they took the devices with them and they kept them for 2 weeks. And during those 2 weeks, they had lots of games on the phone that they could play as they wanted to. They didn't have to play the games. But the games were all based on information that they'd found out at the zoo. So they had like crosswords and fun sort of games. And they had to be able to do these games, they had to kind of read more information about the animals. So it was a kind of an extension activity. Fine. Then what they did was they carried out post-tests after all of this to look at exactly how much vocabulary acquisition there had been short term and then longer term, like 3 months later. And guess which group had learnt the most vocabulary? Now, most people would say the third group.
Yeah.
In fact, there was no significant difference between the second and the third groups.
Okay.
Although the motivation of the third group who'd taken the tablets, the mobile devices home seemed to be increased. But the main factor here seemed to be not so much the devices as the amount of time that the students actually had being exposed to the vocabulary. So there was no significant difference, in fact, between the 3 groups as far as I can. Let me just check that. Yeah, no significant difference between the 3 groups, but more motivation in the 2 groups who'd gone to the zoo, but no significant difference between the 2 who'd gone to the zoo, if you see what I mean. Which is quite interesting. And this is also backed up by a different sort of study, but one that I call the crossword study. And this is a very simple, small experiment, and one that you could actually do with your own classes fairly simply. This was in Taiwan, 2009, just one group of one class. And what they did was they split it into 2 groups, and the kids were given a crossword puzzle, same crossword puzzle, one on paper, one on a tablet device, exactly the same content. The kids played with that for a while, and then they had post-tests. And they found that they all acquired vocabulary in the post-test, but there was no significant difference between those who'd done it on paper and those who'd done it on the mobile devices, although acquisition, motivation, and attitudes had improved for both groups. Which kind of points to it's actually the game or the design, the crossword idea is actually the determining factor here, not the device through which it's delivered, whether it's on paper or through a mobile device. So that's another very interesting study in which we kind of assume that because students are using, a new shiny, phone to do a crossword puzzle, that they're going to learn better. But actually, evidence shows that this is not necessarily the case.
Thanks. Now, moving on from that, for that assumption, you were saying that students will learn better with the new shiny device. One thing we hear vast amounts about is the idea that young learners now are digital natives who have an intrinsic affinity with devices and learning online and so on. What are your thoughts on that, and what evidence is there to support that?
Yeah, well, it's a myth. I mean, I think let's just get that straight. For some reason, our EFL community has really taken that term digital native and its converse digital immigrant. They've really taken it on board, but it really is a complete myth. It was coined in about 2002 by Mark Prensky, and it sort of summed up a certain zeitgeist at the time. But these days, I mean, I think it's just not very realistic. What's very interesting, though, is that we do sort of assume, like you say, Alistair, that our younger learners are somehow sort of better. They're kind of, they're comfortable with technology. The thing is that while they may be comfortable with technology, they're not very critical users or very effective users of technology. And this has actually been borne out as well by research. Again, it's not just me saying it or many other people saying it. There's one study, for example. I've got lots of notes here because I can never remember when these studies were carried out and who by who. This was a huge study carried out pretty recently, 2013, 60,000 kids aged 13 to 14 in 21 countries. Okay, that's quite a lot of people. And what they did was they gave them these kind of tests, if you like, about getting them to use technology in different ways and do different kind of things, and to kind of test how good they were at using technology. It was different tasks, randomized, fairly comprehensive tasks, and the results, they basically categorized these kids into kind of proficiency of use from level 4, which would be extremely proficient, down to level 1, which would be minimally proficient at using technology, okay, at using technology. And they found that of all this vast number, 60,000, 87% of them were in band 1 and 2, which are the lowest, with the majority at 2, which is still pretty low. We would assume higher. But one interesting thing that they found, or a couple of interesting things, was that this kind of technological proficiency, we might call it, or digital literacy, depended on a number of extra factors. For example, the students' expected educational attainment, so whether they were good students or not, basically. The parents' educational level and profession. So the more educated the parents were, the higher the scores the kids seemed to have. The number of books in the home, another one that impacted positively, and also the number of the amount of access that the kids had to technology in the home impacted positively. But things like low socio-economic status impacted very negatively on their test scores. So clearly it's not just the technology and being good at using it. There are all sorts of external factors that will impact on a child's digital literacy or lack of digital literacy, perhaps.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for, but thank you so much, Nicky. That was really interesting. I certainly learnt a lot from that, and I hope everyone else did too. And have a very good weekend.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and I hope it was useful.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.